Hi, this is Andrew, and this is Keen On, the daily now.tv chat show with some of the world's leading thinkers and writers. Hello, everybody. It is Thursday, March the 28th, 2024. Some 50 years ago, actually 52 years ago, one of the best-selling books of the year was called The Age of Uncertainty by the Harvard economist John Kenneth Galbraith. I once bumped into Galbraith. He was a remarkably tall man and a brilliant writer and observer. The book did very well and captured the uncertainty of the late 1970s. We've done lots of shows on the similarities between the 70s and the 20s, the 2020s. And it seems one area where there are particular similarities is the sense that we're living in uncertain times. My guest today is the co-author of an interesting new book, B. Janet Hibbs. You're Not Done Yet: Parenting Young Adults in an Age of Uncertainty. She is a psychologist, an observer of young people, and she's in private practice, and she's also a much accomplished author, and she's joining us from Washington, D.C. B, this idea of living in uncertain times, do you think most people think they live in uncertain times, or are there certain moments in history, like the 1970s, for example, that John Kenneth Galbraith was writing about, or the mid-20s that you're writing about?
I think there are inflection points in history, and I think we have arrived at one, although it was a crescendo really for about the last 20 years. But part of what's happening is that people, because of the uncertainties, the rapid socioeconomic, technological, and sociopolitical changes, disruptions, have had an unbelievable rise, historic rise in anxiety, both for young adults, which is twice the rate it is for adolescents, which is pretty staggering, but also for parents of the young adults. They have seen greater increases in their own anxiety and depression than we have seen for decades. It's historically high.
Yeah, we've touched on this many times in different ways on this show, this rise in anxiety. Right. Is it like COVID, a kind of epidemic in your view?
COVID was an accelerant to many of the trends that preceded it. In the United States, part of what has been occurring is that I call it the historic scarring of this generation. Some of it was universal. It affected both generations, but because young adults will carry the scars longer, it has more deeply affected them in terms of their financial worries, their achievement pressures, their sense that the world is unraveling, and also the dislocation of loss of meaning, purpose, and loneliness. It has been really frightening to see how pervasive this is for young adults who grew up believing that they would have the same kind of rollout to adulthood that their parents had. However, the generational baton pass takes a full decade longer now.
On your website, you have a quote from the 19th century Danish philosopher Kierkegaard, a famous quote. He wrote, "We live our lives forward, but understand them backward." Is this crisis of not being able to live our lives forward for the generation that you're writing about, the generation, of course, of the 70s, the Kenneth Galbraith generation, was the classic boomer baby generation, where life was seen as a standard narrative. You grew up, you left your family, you became an adult, you became a parent, so on and so forth. Today, that narrative has been inverted. So we're living in a surreal way backward?
We are, I think, have been, both parents and young adults, blindsided by the changes. And I think part of why I wanted to explain what's changed and why in the book. So there are different parts to the book. Part one really talks about what has changed, why has it changed, and the recognition that parents are now in the longest stage of parenting that they will ever be in, which is adult to adult. However, they did not expect to be supporting financially and emotionally their young adults through their 20s and into their early 30s. Young adults also there's been a new developmental stage among developmentalists, developmental psychologists for the last 25 years called emerging adulthood. So in the professional world, people were aware that this was happening, but there was very little advice for parents. There was very little rollout for what could expect. And so often they blamed themselves, they blamed each other in that kind of generational cross-blaming way, and you don't understand, and calling each other kind of by stereotypes. And so I thought, that we are really off track here, because both generations really need each other in order to accomplish the mission of launching the next generation.
B, there's a huge literature on this, both scientific, medical, cultural, sociological. There are some people, and I'm sure you've come across this argument all the time, who argue that this generation is the snowflake generation. They've been spoilt by their parents, and that these kids should just be pushed out the door and essentially forced to do what their parents did, go out and get a job. The job still exists. They can find a place to live. How would you respond to that argument, that nothing really has changed? It's just that this generation has been spoiled by a culture of helicopter parenting.
First, I think it is a stereotype that deserves to be challenged, because the parents, in my view, were acting normally to an anxiety-driven time historically, where they recognized that the stability that they had in their own young adulthood was gone. It was gone for their children, where getting into the right kindergarten or the right grade school became like a gladiator contest. It was a harsher, more competitive world. We had not only the 9/11 attacks, which some of the younger generation actually were impacted by, but their parents were, and that does impact children growing up. There was a 2008 Great Recession, which went on to 2011 with a flatline economic recovery, an hourglass economy, where the college degree deflation really was, you had to have a degree to get a job that you could have gotten with a high school education in the prior 20 years. And it would have been a living wage job, and it no longer was, even with a college degree. Multi-generational living became the norm even before COVID-19 pandemic hit. It is still the norm in the United States. So parents they were not neurotic. They were appropriately anxious for their children. They were blamed for it. So the court of public opinion always has an opinion on what's wrong with the kids, what's wrong with the adults, what's wrong with the parents, what they get wrong. And part of what I would say is that they were responding to a rapidly changing and mostly out of their control macro societal, economic, technological changes. It was a period of very rapid change. It still is.
But isn't that always the case with history? You often hear kids say, I lived through 9/11. Obviously, if you're parents or you happen to be
right
in the Twin Towers on that day, it's a catastrophe, a massive tragedy. But for most of us, we just watched it on television. The same is true in some ways of the 2008 Great Recession, even of COVID. The nature of history is one of great change. In the 70s, there were Middle Eastern wars, huge strikes, massive spikes in oil, inflation, unemployment. Aren't we back to normal now? Aren't we back in Of course, some people talked about the end of history. We're back in history, and the period we're living through now, with all its manifold economic, cultural, political uncertainties, is really just business as usual.
Well, that's one position. Part of what I would say is that if you think about the 70s, and I agree with you that history is always throwing, and life is bumpy, it's not linear. There were changes in every generation. Every generation had to encounter and live in a new world than the ones their parents had lived in that coming of age period. However, part of what's changed, obviously, is that we didn't have 24/7 access in the palm of our hand to like the new, latest, greatest horror that we could like pull up anytime, day or night. And we weren't engaging in social media where we were disagreeing with people, where the degree of polarization was as high as it is today, and where there was as much fear about what would happen in a worldwide way. Certainly we could look at World War II and we could look at World War I, but when you think about what followed World War II, while there were outlying events, in the first world countries, there was a period of great recovery, great stability. And for the United States, there was 40 to 50 years of like incredibly secure economic times, which it made college more affordable. College is now 180% higher tuition than it was 40 years ago when there was a big push, College for All, by the Reagan presidency, which has resulted in a fourfold increase in college enrollment, which is now totally stalled, but also with people being very encumbered by student debt. By the 1990s, the family and the student became primarily responsible for affording college, even while being told that it was absolutely necessary for job success.
Of course, it wasn't entirely true, certainly for African Americans, but
no,
that's another story. And I don't want to call you on that one because
no, but you're right. You're right. The minorities.
I mean, that's not your area. I wonder one other change, B, is back in the 70s, there wasn't the prevalence of professionals like yourself.
Right.
For people watching, B. Janet Hibbs, MFT, PhD. We don't know what a PhD stands for. The reason I put these terms up is because it's on the cover of the book. What is an MFT, B?
MFT is Master Family Therapy, and it is a part of psychology, but there are many niches in psychology, and a PhD is a doctorate of philosophy, and you major in the area that you want to specialize in, and for me, it was psychology.
Some people, and I'm sure you've heard this argument many times by patients, clients, critics, colleagues, that we live in the age of therapy, that everything has been made into therapy. Obviously, this is a chicken and egg. I'm guessing professionals like you would say, well, that's because of our age of uncertainty and anxiety. What comes first, though? Your class of professionals and your language and your manuals for dealing with this crisis, or the situation itself? Are they so bound up with one another that they're hard to separate?
They can be. And one of the reasons that my co-author and I, Dr. Rustain, wrote this was to depathologize what's going on. So many professionals in my field are associated with like self-help, or more than self-help, professional help, because, people are experiencing record numbers of mood disorders, anxiety, depression, that sort of thing. Part of what I would say is that one of the things that's changed is that there are very few institutional supports now to help people manage and cope. Family has actually become much more primary than it had been. This generation reports being much closer to their parents than the prior generation was. And parents and young adults really feel very good about how close they've become. And yet parents who have followed kind of a breadcrumb trail, we used to get advice from our own families and nearby neighborhoods and communities. But once someone leaves the educational system, whether that's high school or community college or college, that that network goes away, and parents are more and more on their own. And part of what's happened today is that an overwhelming number of parents of young adults, 75%, feel extremely responsible, 20% feel very responsible, 5% say had nothing to do with me. So parents are very, very, they feel like it's an enormous self-reflection on whether their children are kind of hitting all the markers of adulthood. It's a reflection on them, their parenting, what did they do right or not. Dr. Rustain and I are trying to help them know it's actually intensive parenting has really been quite helpful to this generation, as much as it can be derided for intensive parenting. The relationships are much closer. I think this will be the first generation in young adulthood that breaks the stigma of mental illness.
There's so many paradoxes here, B. You talk about intensive parenting of this generation. And they brought up kids, the kids you know certainly better than most, who are struggling, but they're not rebellious. We don't have punk rock. We barely even have rock and roll. They dress like us. They have the same interests. They go to the same movies. They use the same devices. The baby boomer generation, in which I'm part of, and probably share most of the cultural assumptions, always assume that their kids would rebel against them. We rebelled against our parents. We defined ourselves again, and again, this is obviously a massive generalization, but many certainly of my generation defined ourselves against our parents, and we shaped our lives accordingly.
Right.
It's enormously paradoxical, isn't it, that my generation has had kids which are so desperate for certainty and conformity?
I think they're desperate for a bit more security than the world is offering right now. And I think that one of the differences, to your point about are we more similar generationally? I think parents in this generation, boomers, really did parent differently. I think that even though it's become, now observed as helicopter, that sort of thing, they were much more aware of what they didn't like about their parents, not understanding them, which kind of led to the rebellion, as you're pointing to. And they made extra efforts to be more understanding or more psychologically aware than they'd experienced. They wanted to have a closer emotional relationship with their children than they'd had with their own parents, where they functioned mostly as adults out of obligation, not because they felt close.
Do you think that the crisis that you deal with professionally and you're writing about, does it reflect the failure of much of the cultural, the political assumptions of the baby boomers, and particularly of the cultural rebellion of the 1960s?
I think it reflects the failures of institutions at large, whether they are educational institutions, cultural, college institutions, high school institutions, to adequately prepare both parents and young adults for what they're likely to encounter. Part of that is changing because colleges, for example, have really had a wake-up call since the pandemic. They really had massive disenrollment during the pandemic. Those numbers are not coming back. Students dropped out many times because of finances, as you're saying, because of 25% from four-year colleges, 40% dropped out of community colleges in their first year, largely just financial. The persons of color have it much harder in terms of that, although I would also want to say that the good finding is that it's the emotional support that parents lend that is as important as material support in terms of college or educational completion. But I do think the institutions have largely, it's a shredded safety net, and parents are on the hook in many ways that they were not in the 70s or 80s, where it was like, drop me off at the corner of University in Maine, I'm on my own, I'm fine. And we realized there were bigger families. We had sibling groups that were much larger. We had much larger networks than kids have now, social networks.
Well, can I rent you out as a parent, B?
Sure.
Probably have to pay, though. Maybe you can be my mother. We are speaking with B. Janet Hibbs, MFT, PhD, co-author of You're Not Done Now, Parenting Young Adults in an Age of Uncertainty. It seems as if children will never grow up. We'll talk about what a young adult means after the break. I'm going to take a short break. I want to thank my friends at Liberties, a quarterly journal of culture and politics, for helping bring us such high-quality guests as B. Janet Hibbs. I'm going to run a short feature, and then we'll be back and talk more specifically about the thesis in B. Janet Hibbs's new book. So don't go away, anyone. We're parenting you all.
News, the noise, there is nuance, insight. Liberties is not just a journal of ideas. It's a meteor of intelligent substance. It's the place to be for engaged citizens. Politics, opinion, substance. Liberties is a triumph for freedom of thought. A quarterly of urgency, of cultural exploration, of intellectual delight, of immaculate prose. It's invaluable. Subscribe now or find Liberties at your favorite bookseller.
And you can subscribe to Liberties at libertiesjournal.com. We are speaking with the estimable B. Janet Hibbs, MFT, PhD, and the co-author of You're Not Done Yet. Fascinating new book about parenting in our age of social media and COVID and all the uncertainties of the economy of the 2020s. Parenting young adults in an age of uncertainty. B, historians always debated the idea of childhood. Some argued that the very idea of childhood was a consequence of modernity. There was no such thing as a child in the Middle Ages. Young people simply went out to work when they were 10, and that was the end of it. For you, what exactly is an adult? And should we be careful using this term?
The correct term for people 18 to 34 is emerging adulthood. And what that means is that it is in between. It's not full adulthood. In the 1950s, sociologists defined adulthood as having 5 milestone markers. They were complete your education, which back in the 50s was more high school or tech school. So complete your education, get a job that's stable or a career, find a partner, have a family, become financially independent. So as I stated earlier, those milestones don't happen in any linear order. They usually do not all get hit, in the 20s. Some of them go into the 30s, and more young adults have a question about do I need to be married? Do I want to have children? So there's a lot of questioning. Some of it is driven by finances. What can I afford? Because if you're still living at home with your parents, you're usually not in your own independent life with a relationship.
Has parenting changed too? You're the expert on this, but I'm guessing that people had children much younger in the 1950s, 60s, even the 70s that Galbraith was writing about. Yeah. Today, people are choosing for one reason or other to have kids later. And how does that impact the idea of parenting and even the concept of being a young adult when your parents are older?
It changed largely because of the College for All push. Prior to that, you could start a family and afford to have a family with a high school education, even in the United States at that time, with one person working, not 2 people, like began to happen more and more in the 80s and 90s here. And so part of how it's changed, I think, is that prolonged education. This is why adulthood is delayed now. 6 years is the new 4 for finishing a college degree, if you finish it. Some people take off and are stop outs. They return, they get their degree later. Many people leave without a degree, no credential, but debt. So all of this hinders financial independence. What happens to parents is that they unexpectedly have a new stage of parenting. They weren't expecting to be hosting multi-generational families, households, but they are. And this, was largely more observed in people of color and minority populations, but it's become much more mainstream and really across the world. There have been in the last 15 years kind of slang for different cultures and languages for what we would regard as like the boomerangers who've like come back to live at home. And so this preceded COVID. It just became much more exaggerated with COVID. It affects parents. They're more anxious. They're more worried. They're often sacrificing their own finances in order to help their young adult. They've postponed what they thought would be their next life stage.
How much of this is cultural? Again, my understanding was that multi-generational households were more prevalent in immigrant communities and in poorer communities. Is that still true? Or has this change that you're observing, is it hitting the white upper middle class as much as it's hitting first-generation immigrants?
No. First-generation immigrants, people of color, can expect a harder time financing adulthood. And they are much more beset by financial worries. If you have a lower quintile income below $30,000, you're going to have a lot more worry financially. But what's happened paradoxically for the people who are better resourced is that they feel enormous achievement pressure. Like, oh my God, if I miss a rung on the ladder up, I'm doomed. They literally think my life is over. It's very catastrophic thinking. It's a byproduct of anxiety. And part of it is just that we didn't prepare young people. We weren't prepared for like how to expect what has been rolling out really for the past 15 years, but it's now just reached enormous proportions societally.
B, what are you trying to tell parents who, and there'll be, I guarantee you, parents in our audience who are all too familiar, uncomfortably familiar with the narrative you're describing.
Yes.
They sent their kids off to college, often expensive colleges. They put a lot of work into making sure they were prepared for college. They get their degree, and then they have no idea what they want to do with their lives, and they want to come back and live at home. What should parents, how should they respond to that?
I don't know that kids want to come back and live at home, but they don't see that they have a lot of options in terms of affording it, especially because of student debt. So what happens can be a good thing because parents and young adults, like close to a majority, agree that they become closer if they come back, emotionally closer, not just, oh, we're sharing space. Because you've entered a new stage of relationship with your child, adult to adult. Like how many of people my age really hashed out their differences with their parents, really sat down and talked about like what, they agreed with, what they didn't agree with. So now we have a chance to have a more collaborative relationship. And young adults, they want advice, but they more want to be understood. They want to be listened to in terms of what's harder for them. And 70% of parents out there who are under the age of 50 believe that young adults will have a much harder time accomplishing like the financial independence, the saving for the future, the getting your own home, or and I think the kind of relationship issues that come with it. They've seen it. They don't just believe it because somebody tells them to believe it. They've lived it. So what we tell parents is like, this is a great chance to help the young adult and benefit from having a closer relationship. And part of how you do that is that instead of you're out of the parenting realm of like, listen to me, I know best, here's my advice, take it. You're really in a collaborative relationship with a young person, your child, but a young adult. And the best way to do that is be positive, be specific about your concerns, be brief and to the point, label your own feelings about kind of what's going on for you as you observe any worry or concern, and make a statement of understanding about what you've understood about their situation, and offer to help. They really look to their parents to advise them about finances, to advise them about their jobs and careers. They less often ask them to talk about mental health issues. When they do, they often talk to their mothers.
Speaking of mental health, there is an assumption, maybe it's wrong, maybe not, that we live in an epidemic of poor mental health, of anxiety, that many of the younger generation, not just in therapy, but are being medicated for their condition. Is there any truth to that, Bea?
There's certainly truth to the fact that there are more young people. As I said, we believe this is really the first generation that doesn't have a negative self-stigma about, I have an anxiety disorder or I am depressed. Many still don't seek professional help. And honestly, there are, if you can do what we call natural therapy, surround yourself with people who are understanding, who are caring, who can be thoughtful with what's going on for you, that's best. That's wonderful. We also really recognize that not every worry or anxiety needs to be treated. Everybody worries. Stress is such a kind of common term now. It's like many people don't know what are the signs of an anxiety disorder, what are the signs of true depression, as opposed to I'm just stressed out. So we do encourage parents and young adults, learn the signs, because the kind of sooner you do get treated, if you actually have a mood disorder, the better off you're going to be.
You slightly sidestepped the question, though. I mean, can parents and should parents be therapists as well as being parents? Is that what you're suggesting?
I'm suggesting that young adults rely on parents for emotional support, not necessarily here's what you do. It's not a fix-it relationship anymore. It's more of like collaborative, like, what do you think? What do you think will be helpful? And so in that sense, I just call that natural therapy. It's not being a therapist to your kid any more than like you're a therapist to your good friend who tells you something that is worrisome or upsetting. It's feeling like, what is like, really the basis of like solid, trustworthy relationships. We feel understood and cared about. That's really what I'm suggesting, that parents have the opportunity to do with their young adults. And it's something that it didn't really happen as much in the prior generations.
It's the C word, collaboration. People often talk about it in the corporation and in broader cultural terms. What about in the workplace? These kids, and lots of media about this. I'm sure you're all too familiar, Bea. Kids struggling to survive at starter jobs within corporations, not used to working in disciplined environments, not showing up on time, not dealing with authority relations very successfully. If you have this rise of the collaborative culture within families, are these kids going to struggle, these young adults, are they going to struggle in the workplace where bosses often will not be, for better or worse, collaborative?
I certainly think that yes, I've certainly heard employers complain about the younger generation. I actually think that was true. I think that's true of every older adult, younger adult generation. They think what's wrong with kids today. And part of it is a developmental issue, which is like you learn, okay, this is the outside world. This isn't my family. This isn't my friend. Like, I have to meet expectations. If I don't meet expectations, I don't keep my job. So I actually think that many young adults already understand that, because their educational path has been very competitive and harsh in many ways. It was like, I never really gave a second thought to like, oh, what do I do with this degree? It's kind of like, I don't know, I just like blah, blah, blah. But it's a wake-up call when you have to support yourself. So I do think that part of what happened along with COVID is that there was a scramble. I would really call it like the the great reshuffling. You know, the younger generation was labeled as the big quitters. I would say, actually, they just left for better jobs. So when they could, because they had more opportunities to leave than they'd had before. And part of what I think is also true is that there always is intergenerational tension and conflict about, you know, do we have the same mission? Do we share the same values? Do we share the same language? Do we understand each other? And so I do think that that's true for some young adults for sure, and that's what gets written up are kind of the stereotypes. But I think most young adults, they want to succeed just like every generation of young adults wants to succeed and have their own life.
Finally, the book is called You're Not Done Yet, Parenting Young Adults in an Age of Uncertainty. But I'm sure a lot of quote unquote young adults will read this. What's your message to young adults? As you suggested, perhaps they need to grow up or be a little bit more realistic in the workplace. Is your message that ultimately they will become adults? In the old days, in the 70s, they became adults, quote unquote, when they were 18 or 20. Now they become adults, what, when they're 30, 32? What will that feel like? What will it look like? And what are you telling them about adulthood?
What we're telling them, my co-author, Dr. Osteen, and I, what we're telling them is that the new normal is delayed adulthood. It's not linear. It's bumpy. It's not their fault. It's not their parents' fault. This is, we're in a historic moment where that has really, in many ways, the result of prolonged education, rapid historic technological, economic change, political disruptions that have made it trickier. And the notion is persist and set your goals, set your, your priorities, and you will achieve the milestones of adulthood. Just don't blame yourself if you haven't done them on the same time schedule that your parents did.
And by the middle of the 21st century, what will these kids look like when they're older people, when they're your age or my age? Will they be different from the people of 50 or 60 or 70 today?
You know, that's a great question that I have no idea of how will they be different. I think the difference currently that will just continue. They're much more psychologically minded. They're much more self-aware. They've grown up in environments in which they have been directed to figure out what's going on, become self-aware. So I think they'll bring that to all aspects of their life, and I hope that it benefits kind of their future generation.